Welcome back to Inflection Point, where we cover everything that's succession and exit plan related. I'm Kevin Conrad, the CEO of the Retirement Planning Group. Again, I am fortunate to have two of my compadres here, Dan Mays and Tom Saboto, both directors in corporate development. And today, I'm really excited about this podcast, guys, because we're going to touch on some of the things I think that really hit home that are always at the forefront of advisors' minds, and that's valuations. Valuations are something that are incredibly complex. It's not as simple as just reading a paragraph and assigning a multiple to your revenue. There's a lot of details that go into creating a valuation for a firm. But where we've agreed, and the things we want to talk about today are the things that for the individuals listening right now, what are the things that they can do to make sure they get a competitive valuation when they get to that point? And how do they, more importantly, how do they maintain their valuations? So there's a couple key points in here, kind of in a random order because there's no perfect way to approach this. One of the things that this often is overlooked, and we're going to start here. When the deals that we've taken a look at, and the deals that Dan you brought to the table, one of the things that we look for in a firm, this is very easy, but sometimes it's hard to have in place, is something non-solicits. And a lot of people some people confuse non-solicit and non-compete, two wildly different things. A non-compete being you're not allowed to compete in the space. A non-solicit is very simple, you're not allowed to solicit and take the business away from the clients. Tom, I'll start with you. What are some of the mistakes that have been made when you've been talking to firms that with regards to non-solicits?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Kevin. So yeah, I think you touch on a very important topic. In speaking with many of the business owners that I've come across, a lot of them take that for granted, right? They think this person that they've hired that is with their business is their best friend, right? My blood brother.
Yeah, right? We had the blood brother conversation.
Someone who's always going to stand by my side if something goes wrong. But you've got to think like a business owner and protect yourself. So when you don't have a non-solicit in place, that buyer of your business is going to be very concerned with what could walk out the door, right? If I'm buying this asset that you've built, what's the risk of somebody leaving me and walking away with these clients? So if you don't have a non-solicit in place with that employee in your firm, you're making a big mistake. And you mentioned non-competes. As you know, non-competes, right, they can vary. Some states say non-competes don't even count, right? There's new laws around non-competes right now. So non-solicits is the most important thing to have if you're going to protect your business the right way.
And I would add just a little bit of context to that. Thank you again for having me. I think ultimately employees benefit from having structure, and as a professionally run organization, not only non-competes or non-solicits, but rather employment agreements, setting expectations about what their role is in the broader organization and how they fit, I think goes a long ways towards helping establish value as well. I think it's important to protect the business, but just having a foundation for all the players in the organization sets your firm apart in the marketplace.
But it definitely, you hit value, right? It affects the value, right? Tremendous. If you do not have a non-solicit in place with those employees, again, the valuation's going down, no doubt about it.
Sometimes people, to your point, they think they just need to have the advisor with the non-solicit. You need to have everybody at your firm with the non-solicit. And the reason for that is, I'll position this. If when I am evaluating firms, and I ask, do you have non-solicits? And they say yes. Well, for everybody? Well, no, just for the advisors. In some of these firms, you've got a young and up and coming person that wants to be an advisor, and has a tremendous amount of client interaction. And if we're embarking on buying that firm and the non-solicit's not in place, we're taking a risk that younger advisor, typically younger, wannabe junior individual that wants to be an advisor could leave.
Kevin, it could be somebody who's handled the financial planning within the
organization.
At the firm, right? It could be an enrolled agent, right, who's been helping if you have a tax component built into your practice.
Yep.
Very important, right? All of those people are important because they could become valuable to a competitor who says, well, if you don't have a non-solicit,
come on over.
Hey, here's a bounty, right? I remember you and I always use that word, right? Here's a bounty for how many of those clients at that old firm can you actually help entice over to this new firm?
Yep, it is a slippery slope. So, you mentioned blood brother a minute ago. Let's go back and revisit that. We were approached, with by a third party that came to us because there was an advisor, mid 40s, and unfortunately he has cancer, and we engaged in conversations with him, and he let us know that it's just him and another guy at the firm. And I asked, do you have a non-solicit? And he said, no, I don't have a non-solicit, but he is a blood brother, and he would never do anything wrong by me. And now we're already dealing with the fact that this guy, this other individual, we don't know him, and I'm sure he's a nice guy, but he could pick up and leave with these clients. So it's very hard for us to engage and buy that business when we have this dangling unknown, because we're getting to meet people for the first time, and they're getting to meet us for the first time, and we're trying to understand, does that lead advisor that owns the entire firm control all the relationships? They're going through a health crisis. What are they, how long has that been going on? Are the relationships still as sticky as they once were? And, lo and behold, in that particular case, his blood brother came back and somewhat held him hostage and said, look, I'm not comfortable going to another firm, and so I'm going to buy it from you for X, and it's kind of a take it or leave it. Well, now firms that were vying for buying it are now taking a step back. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get to terms. One of the pieces of advice I will give advisors listening, the time to get non-solicits signed are when you're hiring people.
Right.
Going back at year 1, 2, year 10 and asking for them to sign a non-solicit, that's a very difficult proposition. So if you're engaging and you need to get best practices moving forward, start now with new hires, all new hires.
Absolutely.
Well, 5 years later, 10 years later, that person you're asking to sign a non-solicit is wondering what's going wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
What's happening?
What's
next?
happening here?
Yeah.
Right. Everything. The wheels start turning. Is he or she thinking of getting rid of me?
Yeah.
Why am I signing this? Right.
Yeah. And it might just be for business continuity plan that we talked about in one of our previous episodes to make sure everything's tightened down. One of the things when we're looking at firms and as we're valuing them, we've noticed that the way a firm manages money, it matters. Because as you're managing assets, you're trying to show that you're organized and have a cohesive process to managing the accounts. If it's Frankenstein together, the little bolting things on, and every portfolio looks a little bit different. Me, anyways, as an acquirer of firms, start to get very concerned about how do we continue this going forward? What have the client expectations been? And so we've seen some scenarios where people, and I caution people against this.
Well, I think you're hitting it right. So the more you do outside the box, it drives the valuation down of your company, right?
Yep.
Because it is there's too many spokes in the wheel that have to stay on, right? So outside the box becomes, for the buyer, that's complex, right? If I can't keep up with every single spoke in that wheel, what am I buying, right?
Yep.
So when you stray from doing things that are easy to manage and easy for someone else to absorb, that becomes a risk because your valuation is going to go down.
We had to walk from a firm in the lower southeast, and I always give general areas because I don't ever want to give Tiffany hands here. Awesome firm, amazing. Had a really interesting subset of clients that they serviced. I was very interested in them, and then I found out that they were doing some model-based portfolios. That was great, but then they had also introduced private real estate into the portfolio on a couple apartment complexes in one state, in one city. And now they've taken even retirement assets and are using those to help buy these things. And that's it was one hurricane away or storm away from disaster. And they were getting so cute with managing the client assets and trying to be that as a key differentiator. And it maybe helped attract a certain type of client, but it's ultimately incredibly tremendous amount of risk in a buyer coming in and absorbing that sort of practice. Product and revenue mix. Dan, you look at revenue runs all the time.
You mentioned something about reading an article and using an average to price your business at. And I think that's one of the common conversations we have with advisors is, so what are the multiples today? And they're most often revenue based, and to oversimplify it, there's recurring and non-recurring multiples. But I really think that does a disservice to the advisor because there isn't a multiple that applies to everybody in the space. But I do think that there's some merit to the idea that the marketplace does place premiums on recurring revenue and more so on different types of products such as advisory today for a whole host of reasons. It's predictable, it's recurring, there may be different regulatory concerns, but also to your point, how it's managed is a key part of that puzzle. If you are an advisor that's doing customized portfolios for every client, that's not scalable. Buyers don't see that as an asset. They see that as a risk, perhaps. So you always want to be mindful of not only is your revenue mix and product mix appropriate, you're not doing funny things with asset classes that may be perceived as risky, but also ensuring that has value in the marketplace for potential buyers.
I think, the multiples also, even the investment banking firms will use a wide range when it comes to multiples, right? Sometimes it could be as wide as you could drive a truck through that range, right?
Yeah.
But it's important because until you know more about the seller's business, right, you just simply can't put a multiple on anything without examining their P&L, right, looking at the quality of assets, the client census, right, how much more runway is left for the buyer to work with those clients, and is there something that's esoteric in there, right, that could affect how the new buyer has to manage those accounts. So ranges, I think I agree with Dan. Don't believe what you read, right? You're reading something in a magazine or you're maybe listening to a different podcast and somebody says it should be worth X. That's just not being fair to the seller, right? There is no magic number that you can really give someone without examining that business. Industry average, right? Kevin, you tell me. What I would say is it maybe 1% is the average fee?
Yeah, roughly,
maybe around roughly out there. But there are some companies or firms, RIA firms, for example, that they may have actually been undercharging. They may have felt the only reason I can get a client
is to
be the lowest cost provider.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't help a buyer. Right? And they think that, I'm managing $100 million. It should be worth X times that. No, because it's not worth just because of the assets. What is it generating for the buyer?
Yep. You brought up margins, revenue multiples, and those. It's not as simple as just applying a cookie cutter mold to each one of those, right? But it's not uncommon for individuals to raise their hands and say, I think it's worth this, without a firm understanding for how they even derive that answer. Dan, you and I were talking before this, a $50 million firm will be valued different than a $1 billion firm, okay? It's just the facts of the matter, okay? We talk about deal structures as well, not just the valuations, but deal structure. So what I mean by deal structure is your firm could have a headline value of this, but the terms look like this, okay? And so I'll give an example. If I came to somebody and I said, we think your firm is worth $500 million. And like, holy cow, that's 500 times more than I thought it was worth.
I'll take it.
But then I give the terms, I'll pay you $1 a year for 500 million years.
Yeah.
Those are terrible terms.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but a lot of the headline values you see out there, you'll see these incredible multiples, but they're if you grow by some incredible amount, if you deliver this sort of net asset growth. And they've set these hurdles that are very difficult to hit, but they give this headline value. And when you look at the law of probability of you getting there, you're going to regress back to what a market rate is. So I think a lot of advisors, I don't want to say get they get wooed by some of these really bombastic numbers that are tossed out there
or
without
they're
understanding, because no one puts terms in.
Yeah, or they're hearing the big number, right? But they don't realize that that large number that may have been paid was because that firm had other components built into it that another buyer didn't have.
Yeah.
Right? That's so different than your average RIA, right? Who, whether you have 100 million or a billion, if you don't have something that the buyer needs, that you built, that buyer cannot build on their own, you're not going to get that high multiple.
The devils are in the details with those. You have to have not only price but terms to understand the economics of a deal.
The total economics. Yeah. So look, we promised things that could help maintain value and or keep value from going backwards. And we touched on having a non-solicits in place, making sure that we have a cohesive thought process for how we manage the accounts, and we're not getting too far outside the box. It could become a turnoff for a lot of buyers. Let's touch on these last couple things here. We talked about fee structure, right? You got to be priced market rate for fee. So, and then I think the last two things I'd like to focus on that advisors can do. Margins matter. Your margin, your profit margin, what you drag to the bottom line matters. So for an example, if you're a $100 million firm with a 10% profit, or you're a $100 million firm with a 30% profit, you tell me which one's going to get a greater valuation. And how do you manage your margins? You got to be very conscientious of, well, what are you charging back to, the assets? What are your expenses too? If you come in staffed out, tons of staff, and you're overstaffed, that's going to hurt the value of your business. A whole nother conversation.
Well,
we'll have another time.
If you're understaffed,
that'll hurt.
Right? If you're understaffed as well, because the buyer has to infuse capital in some way, right? Whether it's human capital or whether it's expansion capital. If you're understaffed, that buyer has to say, well, how am I going to support those clients?
So let's talk about that for a second. Let's dig into that, because it's probably a larger conversation, but let's touch on it. Conversely, a lot of times, we hear advisors, I don't know if the term's right, but brag about, their margins being 80% or 90%. And, that becomes problematic for someone that's looking to acquire the business, because I know that advisor is, in those sort of instances, they don't ever go on vacation. They're doing all the paperwork. They're doing all the HR, the books. They're managing the accounts. They're doing the marketing. They never get a break. They're wearing 19 hats, as I say all the time. And so they're not invested into the business. And so when someone acquires that business, they've got to pay somebody to manage the business. An advisor has to step in and manage that business. And so that becomes problematic, I think, as advisors out there are looking at those sort of margins. What have you guys seen in that capacity?
I agree 100%. I think it's counterintuitive for a lot of advisors that think that the more I can make in profit, the more valuable the business is. But there's diminishing returns if you're not investing in growth, in stability, in non-competes, non-solicitations for your clients. There's an investment that has to be made for a business to be healthy and to be maintained, even if you're not growing. But to be able to maintain that organization over time, you have to invest, and that comes in the form of expenses.
Yeah, I mean, if I heard 80 to 90% margins, my antenna would go up, honestly. I'd be wondering, it just doesn't sound right to me. So I'd be concerned. I'd be looking for, what isn't that person telling me about their business, right? It just sounds unbelievable.
Yeah. It is, and it's fun. Typically, it's because they're just a one-man or one-woman show doing all of that work. And Tom, like, they show up at the retirement planning group. We're going to provide all sorts of value-added benefits to their clients, and that comes with some costs. And so it's just important to, I think, help advisors understand that those large margins don't necessarily translate into some giant multiple.
Yeah.
There's an adjustment that happens on those profit margins.
Every now and then you'll see an advisor where they've made investments over their career. So they've invested over time into a CRM or processes and systems, investment models that are replicable. They're not doing one-off portfolios for every client, right? I think there's some efficiency that can be gained that you can benefit from in the form of a lower expense. However, I don't think that that's sustainable as the business grows over time.
You know, let's end here. There's, again, valuation is a really important topic for a lot of advisors out there. Clearly, right? We talked about this is probably the largest financial transaction they're going to.
It's always the question.
Yeah.
It's the question.
You're right. It's the question. Like, what do you think this thing's worth?
Yeah.
You know, and it's detailed analysis at the end of the day.
Right.
I'm going to give this.
It's not worth a lot unless you can really give us the real information, right? You've got to let us take a look at the entire financials of your firm, because other than that, it's just talk.
Well, there's financials, there's other elements. I was looking at a business here just very recently, great business, high level of income and revenue to the advisor. On paper, everything looked good until we looked at the client demographics. The average age of the client was over 80, and over 80% of the assets were with clients over age 80. That's a significant factor in value, right? So there's, and that may not have been the only issue if the advisor was working on a multi-generational engagement with their clients, right? That can help a lot too.
I'm going to give one final tip here for all of our listeners, because we see this happen. This is a two-way street, okay? I understand that there's a lot of interest in firms that are where advisors are looking to transition out. A lot of interest. And so it's not just the advisor that should be analyzed. The advisors should understand that they're not just analyzing the options they have in front of them. The acquirers are also analyzing, are they going to be a good fit for us? And one of the things that I'm always looking at is how long, sounds so simple, but it's often missed out on. How long does it take you to get us documents on your business? If we ask, what's your average client age? How many clients do you have? That's been a stumbling block sometimes. What's your profit margin? The longer it takes us to garner that information or harvest it or have you present it to us, the more uncomfortable I start to get, because I started getting concerned that you don't know the unit economics of your own business.
Everything's hidden in a different drawer.
Yeah, and so now I'm like, how healthy is the business? So, for our listeners, having your ducks in a row and understanding your unit economics, understanding your profit and loss, understanding your average client age, understanding the bands of assets in each of these, and being able to discuss those will be conversations that you'll have. And the more you're upfront with that, you're developing a relationship with the firm that's acquiring you. It's the authenticity and the communication going back and forth is indicative of how it will work post-transaction versus constantly pulling information out.
And be prepared for change, right? You can't go into a transaction and expect everything to stay exactly the way it is. So a buyer should be upfront about what is going to change, right? And explain that we're still getting to the same result. I'm getting your client from A to B to C. It's just a little bit different of a roadmap to get there. So there's going to be some change, and they have to really lean into that change and say, it's okay. I know that someone else.
It'll be okay.
It's going to be okay.
Yep. Dan, Tom, thanks so much for being here today. For all the advisors out there that have spent the time listening, I really appreciate it. Inflection Point is really about continuing to demystify the succession and exit planning process. And we look forward to bringing even more value-added nuggets of content in the future. So thank you very much.